Most observers believe governmental breakdown arrives with fanfare, unmistakable and theatrical. Yet the reality proves far more disturbing because it typically begins in hushed conference rooms with a notion that appears ridiculous initially, then gradually reveals something far more profound. What unfolds here transcends territorial ambitions or trade disputes or border enforcement. It concerns the mechanics of authority, when devotion flows only upward, never reciprocated, how bureaucracies react when intimidation ceases to function, and why a leader who flourishes amid turbulence can abruptly discover himself encircled by opposition he cannot dominate. This narrative unfolds not through headline alerts or trending videos, but through the intervals between, the pregnant pauses, the equivocating declarations, the silent rebellions, and the choices that escape public notice yet alter trajectories. By this account's conclusion, you'll grasp why apparent political cacophony actually constitutes forewarning, why authority's most perilous moment isn't its ascension but its dissolution, and why this juncture carries greater weight than most comprehend. Continue reading, because once the configuration becomes visible, you cannot reverse that perception. And the closing revelation transforms how this entire chronicle must be interpreted. Picture a tranquil dawn in the capital, the variety where executive corridors appear serene superficially. Yet beneath that quietude, something combustible accumulates. Mobile devices vibrating in jacket pockets, assistants sharing glances without utterances, everyone detecting that today deviates from routine. And somewhere within that edifice, President Marcus Dane circles an obsession that refuses departure from his consciousness, an obsession that sounds preposterous to external observers, but radiates power to him, the acquisition of Valhalla Island. And in that instant, what commences as a diplomatic headline subtly metamorphoses into something far weightier, a chronicle about devotion, vanity, retribution, and a governmental apparatus beginning to splinter under the pressure of one individual's impulses. For Marcus Dane, authority has never concerned frameworks or methodology. It has perpetually centered on capitulation, about allegiance extended upward without interrogation. And that explains why this moment carries such significance. Because while Dane demands unconditional fidelity from those surrounding him, he has never believed in reciprocating it. And now, finally, members of his own coalition are beginning to comprehend the price of that asymmetry. When parliamentary Republicans resist, when even the most aggressive voices pause, Dane doesn't perceive policy discord. He perceives treachery, and treachery to Dane is inexcusable. That's why the Valhalla episode isn't genuinely about territory or resources or tactics. It's about dominion, about Dane testing whether the coalition still recoils when he speaks. And for the first occasion in considerable time, the recoil doesn't materialize. Speaker Nathan Crawford steps before the cameras, maintaining nothing is transpiring, maintaining there's no conflict, no aggression, no emergency. But what he's genuinely doing is attempting to preserve a chamber majority so precarious that a single fracture could collapse the entire framework. And when he blames the press or opposition for magnifying Dane's own statements, it's not communication strategy, it's containment. The contradiction is transparent and perilous simultaneously, because Dane's legal position to the Supreme Tribunal is that trade restrictions are warranted by national defense. Yet his supporters claim there exists no national defense concern regarding Valhalla Island, and both assertions cannot be accurate concurrently. This is where the parliamentary revolt begins to crystallize, not as theatrical mutiny, but as something far more threatening to Dane, a collective awareness. Senator Richard Vail doesn't sound passionate when he declares, "There is no Republican backing for this." Even among the aggressive faction, he sounds systematic, institutional, like someone reminding the apparatus that it still functions. And that matters because Dane's authority only operates when people believe he is unavoidable. Senator Thomas Ridge equivocates, avoids complete endorsement, discusses tangentially to the matter instead of embracing it, and that hesitation alone transmits a signal that Dane perceives instantly. Then arrives Senator William Morrison, and his chronicle is the warning tale every Republican grasps immediately, because Morrison did everything Dane commanded after the impeachment proceedings. He humbled himself publicly. He voted in manners he knew were incorrect. He pursued approval that never materialized, and the instant he stopped being beneficial, Dane annihilated him politically without hesitation. That endorsement of Morrison's primary opponent wasn't merely vengeance, it was a communication. Loyalty to Dane is never insurance, it's a postponement. And witnessing that transpire in real time compels Republican parliamentarians to confront a truth they've evaded for years. Dane will abandon any of them if it nourishes his ego. This is where the collective coordination dilemma becomes evident, because Dane can intimidate individuals, but he struggles against coalitions, and history demonstrates it. When Republicans mobilize collectively, when opposition becomes communal, Dane loses focus. He gets sidetracked. He progresses onward because sustained confrontation requires discipline, and discipline has never been his forte. That's why Valhalla, like the classified documents before it, becomes another instance of Dane exceeding his reach, then withdrawing once the expense escalates. And while this unfolds on the international platform, the same configuration appears domestically through the Border Enforcement Agency, where authority without oversight turns brutal. And when voices like Congressman David Santos contend that increased appropriations and enhanced preparation won't remedy an organization constructed on hostility and intimidation, they're not merely critiquing policy. They're describing the inevitable result of Dane's governance philosophy. The agency becomes a mirror of Dane himself, unrestrained, unaccountable, shielded by devotees who refuse to acknowledge the destruction because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging him. The discussion over reformation versus elimination isn't rhetorical. It's foundational because you cannot adjust a mechanism designed to frighten, just like you cannot delicately manage a presidency propelled by impulse rather than principle. Dane governs by intuition. And when institutions resist those intuitions, he assaults the institutions, the tribunals, the parliament, the media, even his own coalition. And in doing so, he isolates himself. By this chapter's conclusion, the genuine conflict is no longer concealed. The parliamentary revolt is no longer theoretical. And Dane's greatest adversary is no longer the opposition. It is his incapacity to maintain loyalty in an apparatus that finally comprehends what he genuinely is. And that realization is only commencing. The instant the parliamentary resistance becomes public, everything inside the Capitol transforms, because once disagreement leaves confidential discussions and enters the record, it can no longer be suppressed. And Marcus Dane feels that transformation immediately, not as a policy complication, but as a personal challenge to his authority, which is why his reaction is not calculated, but vindictive, instinctive, and vociferous, lashing out at individuals rather than addressing the substance of the rebellion, a configuration that has defined his entire political existence. Behind the scenes, Republican parliamentarians are conducting conversations they have avoided for years, hushed but pressing exchanges about survival, not philosophy, because they now perceive the same thing opposition members have perceived throughout, that Dane does not shield allies, he depletes them. And once that realization establishes itself, apprehension begins to change trajectory. The chamber, meanwhile, is functioning in a condition of barely controlled alarm because Nathan Crawford knows something Dane does not, that mathematics matter more than devotion. And when margins are razor thin, even symbolic turbulence becomes hazardous. Every time Dane introduces another escalation, another trade threat, another ambiguous national defense rationale, Crawford sees not strength, but volatility. And volatility is toxic for marginal district Republicans who already feel the foundation shifting beneath them. This is why Crawford denies reality so forcefully, why he insists nothing is occurring, even as everyone can observe that something very clearly is. Because admitting reality would compel him to choose between defending Dane and defending the institution he commands, and he knows those two objectives are no longer aligned. In the parliament, that separation becomes sharper by the day because resistance there is not passionate. It is methodical, grounded in constitutional language, statutory boundaries, and the kind of deliberate grinding resistance that Dane finds impossible to neutralize. When parliamentarians discuss trade restrictions originating in the chamber, about emergency authorities being misused, about tribunals intervening, they are executing something Dane has always dreaded. They are relocating the conflict onto terrain where his intuitions do not function. Dane thrives in disorder, in ambiguity, in spectacle, but institutions respond to precision. And the more precise the legal and constitutional parameters become, the smaller Dane's space to operate becomes. This is why he redirects his attention back to punishment, to examples, to ensuring everyone witnesses what befalls those who deviate from alignment, because apprehension has always been his preferred enforcement tool. But the complication is that apprehension only functions when people believe compliance will rescue them, and William Morrison's political execution proves that it will not. That lesson reverberates quietly through the Republican conference, altering calculations in ways Dane cannot detect because he mistakes silence for submission, not realizing that silence can also be preparation. And while all of this transpires, the media ecosystem amplifies the disorder and fragments, disconnected segments, surface-level indignation. But the genuine chronicle is deeper and more gradual. A governing coalition losing coherence, a coalition realizing it has bound itself to someone who cannot be managed, disciplined, or restrained. This erosion becomes even more apparent when the conversation shifts to the Border Enforcement Agency, because immigration enforcement exposes the moral consequences of Dane's worldview more explicitly than almost any other issue. David Santos's comments cut through the usual talking points precisely because they refuse to accept the comfortable falsehood that superior preparation or increased appropriations can repair a mechanism built to intimidate. And that refusal compels opposition members, especially moderate ones, into an uncomfortable position. For years, incrementalism has been their defense, the concept that every broken apparatus can be nudged back into alignment with sufficient adjustments and reforms. But the agency under Dane resists that logic because it is not malfunctioning. It is functioning exactly as designed. Brutality, racial targeting, absence of accountability. These are not defects. They are characteristics of a framework that derives its legitimacy from intimidation rather than consent. And that is why the discussion becomes existential rather than technical. Dane's defenders argue that enforcement equals protection, but what they never explain is why protection seems to require degradation, why order demands savagery, and why accountability is treated as vulnerability. This is where the Valhalla episode and the agency discussion intersect, because both reveal the same governing impulse, the conviction that authority is most effective when unrestricted, when decisive action replaces deliberation, and when disagreement is framed as disloyalty. The parliamentary revolt threatens that impulse directly because it introduces the concept that boundaries still matter, that even a president obsessed with supremacy can be constrained, and that concept is more dangerous to Dane than any electoral defeat. As pressure accumulates, Dane grows louder but less concentrated, cycling through grievances, attacking multiple targets simultaneously, diluting his own message. And this scattered approach signals something important to experienced political observers. Not confidence, but strain. Dane does not withdraw when he feels powerful. He withdraws when he feels inundated. When the conflict becomes too complex to dominate through sheer force of personality. And that is exactly where this moment is headed, toward a confrontation not defined by a single dramatic collapse, but by a slow accumulation of resistance, legal obstacles, institutional friction, and political exhaustion. By this chapter's conclusion, the question is no longer whether Dane can advance his agenda, but whether he can maintain control over a coalition that is starting to recognize that survival may depend on permitting him to fail. And that realization, once it takes hold, does not dissipate. By the time this conflict reaches its third phase, the energy inside the Capitol has changed completely, because what began as deflection has turned into weariness, and weariness is the most dangerous state for a political movement constructed on intimidation and spectacle. Marcus Dane can survive outrage, he can survive scandal, but what he cannot survive easily is sustained resistance that refuses to react emotionally, and that is precisely what begins to form across multiple fronts simultaneously. The parliament no longer treats his threats as urgent emergencies, but as procedural complications, scheduling hearings, invoking statutes, requesting tribunals to intervene. And every one of those steps strips Dane of the oxygen he relies on. In the chamber, Nathan Crawford's balancing act becomes increasingly untenable because the more he denies reality, the more obvious it becomes that reality is prevailing, and members in vulnerable districts start to calculate how much longer they can afford to be tied to disorder. Behind closed doors, Republican strategists whisper about timing, about distancing, about whether permitting Dane to self-destruct might be safer than continuing to defend him. And those whispers are never meant to reach him because everyone understands that Dane reacts to apprehension with retaliation, not reform. Meanwhile, Dane himself grows increasingly erratic, jumping from Valhalla to trade restrictions to immigration to personal grievances, unable to concentrate on a single narrative long enough to dominate it. And that loss of narrative control is not accidental. It is the result of too many fires burning simultaneously, each one demanding attention, each one exposing boundaries he cannot spin away. This is where the media conflict intensifies, not in Dane's favor, but against him, because even sympathetic outlets struggle to reconcile his claims with visible institutional resistance. And when allies begin to equivocate on air, it signals to audiences that something is wrong beneath the surface. Dane senses this shift instinctively, and his response is predictable: louder rhetoric, harsher attacks, more extreme framing. But volume cannot replace coherence, and over time it only accelerates exhaustion. The agency discussion becomes a flashpoint precisely because it compels a moral clarity that Dane's style cannot easily obscure. And when Santos and others argue that accountability, not expansion, is the only path forward, they are implicitly accusing the administration of valuing authority over people. That accusation resonates beyond partisan boundaries because chronicles of abuse, targeting, and brutality are no longer abstract. They are personal, local, and impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents. Moderate opposition members attempt to reframe the issue as a preparation problem, a management problem, anything that avoids confronting the framework itself. But that avoidance begins to look like complicity, and grassroots pressure grows in response. What makes this moment different from past controversies is convergence. Immigration enforcement, executive overreach, foreign policy recklessness, and constitutional conflict are no longer separate discussions. They are pieces of the same chronicle. And that chronicle is about a presidency that cannot operate within boundaries. Tribunals loom larger now, not as abstract arbiters, but as active participants. And Dane's reliance on emergency authorities becomes a liability rather than a strength, because every invocation invites scrutiny, delay, and potential reversal. The Supreme Tribunal, once treated by Dane as a safety mechanism, now represents uncertainty because legal arguments grounded in national defense lose credibility when policy appears impulsive rather than strategic. Dane's frustration grows, and frustration has always been his indicator, leading to impulsive decisions that create new complications faster than his team can contain them. Republican parliamentarians notice this, not with outrage, but with calculation, understanding that the more Dane lashes out, the more he alienates potential defenders. This is the psychological turning point because Dane's authority has always depended on the conviction that he is feared. But apprehension without respect collapses into resentment, and resentment eventually turns into resistance. By now, even devotees understand that defending Dane requires them to absorb destruction he will never repay, and that realization changes behavior in subtle but significant ways. Missed calls, delayed statements, carefully worded responses that neither endorse nor attack. Dane interprets this as treachery, but in reality, it is self-preservation, and self-preservation is stronger than devotion. When devotion guarantees nothing, the administration begins to feel hollow, decisions announced without follow-through, threats issued without escalation, And for the first time, Dane's opponents stop reacting to him as if he is unstoppable. That shift in perception is quiet but powerful because once inevitability disappears, so does much of his leverage. By this chapter's conclusion, the presidency feels less like a force moving history and more like a storm burning itself out. Loud, destructive, but increasingly contained by frameworks it cannot overpower. And everyone watching understands that the final act is approaching, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a reckoning shaped by institutions, exhaustion, and the boundaries Dane has spent years pretending do not exist. By the time this chronicle reaches its final stage, the disorder no longer feels explosive, but revealing, because what has been exposed is not just the fragility of one presidency, but the boundaries of a political culture that tolerated it for far too long. Marcus Dane does not fall because of a single scandal, a single vote, or a single act of defiance. He weakens because the apparatus he tried to bend finally refuses to move at his speed. And that resistance, slow and unglamorous, is precisely what democracy looks like when it functions. The Valhalla fantasy fades into the background, not because it is resolved, but because it loses its power to intimidate. And that loss matters more than any policy outcome, because Dane's greatest weapon has never been action. It has been apprehension. In the parliament, what began as hesitation solidifies into distance, then into quiet independence, and parliamentarians who once flinched now calculate, understanding that Dane's anger is temporary, but electoral consequences are not. In the chamber, Nathan Crawford's denial becomes irrelevant because reality no longer needs validation. Voters can perceive dysfunction on their own, and denial loses its effectiveness when contradictions pile too high to ignore. The tribunals continue their methodical work, stripping emergency authorities of their mystique, forcing arguments into daylight, and reminding the nation that authority must justify itself, not demand obedience. On immigration, the agency discussion crystallizes a broader truth, that mechanisms built on degradation cannot be repaired through optics, and that genuine protection cannot coexist with unaccountable brutality. A realization that pushes opposition members toward a choice they have long delayed, whether to manage injustice more politely or confront it directly. What ties all of this together is a single uncomfortable lesson. Marcus Dane did not invent these fractures, he exploited them. And when exploitation is no longer profitable, the exploiter loses focus. Dane grows quieter, not humbled but sidetracked, shifting focus, repeating grievances, unable to sustain a narrative that no longer commands the room. And that is how his influence recedes, not with a bang, but with diminishing returns. The Republican coalition, left to survey the destruction, faces its own reckoning. Whether devotion to a single individual was worth the erosion of credibility, the loss of institutional respect, and the normalization of disorder as governance. This is the moment where responsibility can no longer be outsourced, where blaming media, opposition, or history stops functioning, and where choices finally matter. For the public, the takeaway is neither comfort nor despair, but clarity. Democracy does not collapse all at once. It erodes slowly when intimidation replaces accountability. And it recovers slowly when people insist on boundaries. What happens next will not be decided by Dane's next outburst, but by whether institutions, lawmakers, and voters remember what this period revealed about authority without restraint. And that is why this chronicle does not end with Marcus Dane. It ends with us, with the question of whether we recognize these warning signs when they appear again, whether we demand more than devotion tests and spectacle, and whether we understand that democracy survives not because leaders are virtuous, but because frameworks are defended by those willing to resist abuse even when it is inconvenient. If this moment teaches anything, it is that unchecked authority always overplays its hand. And when it does, the only thing that determines the outcome is whether people are paying attention.